You know, in the long, dark history of crime, some names, they're more than just names, right? They belong to legends, to phantoms. And today, we're cracking open the case file on maybe the most famous phantom of them all, Jack the Ripper.
I mean, it's a fascinating question, isn't it? It's never just about the crime itself. It's about the time, the place, the sheer terror, and, of course, the one thing this case has in spades, an unsolved mystery. This question is really at the very heart of the entire Ripper story.
So, let's start with that name, Jack the Ripper. You'd think the police came up with it, but nope. It wasn't a name they discovered tracking a lead. It was a brand name, basically, probably made up by a journalist or some hoaxer just to sell newspapers. And that was maybe the most important first step in turning a brutal killer into this terrifying piece of folklore.
To really get a feel for the fear, you have to picture the scene. This wasn't the London of fancy palaces and gentlemen. Oh no, this was Whitechapel in 1888. Think of a maze of dark, foggy, gaslit alleys, overcrowded slums, and just crushing poverty. It was a place where life was cheap, and a predator could move around like a ghost.
And that brings us to the period that would go down in history as the Autumn of Terror. This is where the legend was truly written in blood. Now, while there might have been more victims, these 5 women are what's known as the canonical 5, the ones everyone agrees were almost certainly linked to a single killer. And it's so important to remember they weren't just names on a list, they were real people, mothers, daughters, just trying to survive in the most difficult circumstances you can imagine.
Okay, what's really wild is this timeline. Just look how compressed it is. This wasn't some killer who waited years between attacks. This was an absolute frenzy. The speed and the sheer nerve were terrifying, especially with the double event, where he killed 2 women on the same night, pretty much right under the noses of the police.
So how did the police even know these crimes were connected? Well, it was the killer's modus operandi, or his MO for short. His signature. It was this chillingly consistent pattern that told investigators they were hunting one single, uniquely brutal person.
And this lays out that signature perfectly. The victims were targeted because they were vulnerable, but the mutilations, the removal of specific organs, that was something else entirely. The precision was so clean it led people to believe the killer had to be a doctor, a surgeon, or maybe a butcher, someone with a steady hand who knew their way around human anatomy.
Now, with a killer this brazen, you'd think an arrest would happen pretty quick. But what actually happened was one of the most famous failed manhunts in history.
I mean, you have to put yourself in their shoes. There was no fingerprinting, no DNA analysis. Criminal profiling as we know it today just didn't exist. Crime scene investigation was, brand new. They were essentially fighting a 20th century monster with 19th century tools. They were totally outmatched.
And this slide really shows the perfect storm they were up against. On one side, you have the police, struggling in the dark, interviewing hundreds of people with no forensic evidence to go on. And on the other side, the press was going wild, creating a complete spectacle, which just whipped up public panic and basically created the Ripper persona. It was a whole new kind of media frenzy.
This is the moment everything changed. The Dear Boss letter. A news agency gets this letter, signed with that chilling name, Jack the Ripper, and they publish it. All of a sudden, the killer has a name. The story wasn't just about a local murderer anymore. It was about a larger-than-life bogeyman.
But then it got worse, a lot worse. This message, the From Hell letter, was sent to the head of a local neighborhood watch group, and it came with a small box. Inside was half of a human kidney. Now, whether it was real or not, its effect was just absolute terror. The killer wasn't just murdering people, he was taunting everyone.
And then, just as suddenly as they began, the murders stopped. It left a city terrified and a police force with 0 answers. So who on earth could have been capable of this? Well, that question is fueled over a century of speculation.
It's almost unbelievable. Over 100 people have been seriously named as potential rippers. We're talking about everyone from unknown immigrants to famous authors, and even members of the royal family. The whole case just became this huge magnet for conspiracy theories.
But out of all that noise, a few names always seem to rise to the top. You've got Druitt, whose suicide right after the last murder was, let's say, suspiciously timed. There was Aaron Kosminski, a guy the police strongly suspected who was later put in an asylum.
and George Chapman, who is the lead investigator's personal favorite. But for every one of these guys, there was a fatal flaw. No hard proof. So ultimately, the case went cold.
And that brings us to the legacy. Why are we still talking about this? Why does this one unsolved case continue to fascinate us more than pretty much any other?
It's because Jack the Ripper became more than just a man. He became a phenomenon. It was the perfect storm for a legend. You had the killer's terrifying anonymity, the birth of sensational media, a shocking look into the dark side of Victorian society, and of course, a puzzle with no solution. It's that mix of factors that makes the story immortal.
And really, that's the ultimate takeaway here. The man, whoever he was, just vanished back into the London fog. But the monstrous identity that he, or the press, created, Jack the Ripper, has lived on for over a century. He's a permanent shadow in our collective imagination.
So I'll leave you with this final thought. Did Jack the Ripper get away with it because he was some brilliant, cunning mastermind who outsmarted everyone? Or was he simply a monster who got lucky in a time and a place that was just perfectly suited to hide his crimes? That's the real enduring enigma.